Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Lab Maniacs Podcast. I'm Sigi and joining me once again is Cameron.
Hey, glad to be here. So today we've got some fun things that we're looking forward to. Sigi, what do you got?
Since we're kind of doing this Competitive EDH 101 series right now, I thought that today would be a good time to talk about some basic CEDH deck building principles.
Oh, that sounds great. Got a lot of stuff to cover there, though.
Oh yeah, definitely. We're just gonna do like the absolute basics, like some key concepts and ideas today. And I'm sure that we're gonna delve into deeper things in later episodes.
Oh yeah.
However, before we get started on that, Cameron, about our podcast.
Yes, we got some good news. We've got an RSS feed up and running. So with that, we were able to get published onto iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or just the straight RSS feed if you have your own aggregator. So we will be putting this on both YouTube and all the different podcast services at the same time. And going forward, we'll be doing the same thing. Super excited about that.
Yeah, it's definitely good to have more outreach. I mean, obviously our main viewer, or in this case listener base, is on YouTube, but I myself enjoy podcasts more on the go, or like when I'm in bed before I fall asleep, and having easy access to the audio version is definitely a good thing.
Oh, for sure. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for everybody to get this. We heard your request. We got it for you.
Yeah. Now, let's get right into it.
Oh, wait 1 second before we do. We had some awesome stuff happen in the 1v1 EDH community going on here. We had LSV and Rich Shea, some of the big pros, playing some EDH and actually putting out content for it. I mean, Channel Fireball put up a series of videos.
Oh, yeah.
For Wizards to take over 1v1 EDH and make it their own format, it's really nice to see the pro level support coming in. And I don't know about you, but I'm really excited to see where this goes. I'm not too sure how much I personally will like the 1v1 EDH format right now. I know they've got bans coming up tomorrow, which will be interesting as well. Everybody's saying Brawl, but
that's not something I'd personally agree with, to be honest. I mean, it's obviously the best deck in the format, but there are a lot of simple ways to make the deck more reasonable without completely destroying it.
True. I mean, Emrakul not being banned and having a mono blue, hey, my counterspells are cheaper and I also get to polymorph commander kind of seems a little asking for trouble. But I mean, it's kind of nice that the community has already come to a little bit of a consensus there on the meta, and I really do hope they change something so it's not 50% Brawl all the time.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I mean, from the looks of it, they are keeping a very close eye on it, at least now during its fledgling stages, so to say, and I assume we're gonna see a lot of like bannings, maybe some unbannings, who knows, over the course of the next couple of months.
Yeah, as much as there's bannings, I'm actually interested in what will be unbanned eventually. It'll be interesting to see, because they started off with a little bit of a heavy hand towards combo.
From what we're seeing right now in the format, Control is king already, and Control is probably the strategy combo struggles against the most.
Yeah.
So it may be interesting to see if they're maybe gonna unban one or two of those good combo win conditions we all love to use here.
Yeah, they're kind of limited by the fast mana, or the lack thereof, but
yeah, good win conditions. That is actually one thing we are going to talk about at length today in our basic CEDH deck building principles episode.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you, when you started tuning your Tessiger deck for CEDH, what were the things you specifically took a closer look at?
Well, there's a few things right off the top. Taking the high cost spells and limiting them to overall lower my converted mana cost threshold. Most decks are looking at like below a 2.5 average CMC across your whole deck. And when I started Tasigur, he was at about 3.5.
Oh, yeah, that is quite a bit above what would be common in competitive EDH.
Yeah, well, I started it in a battle cruiser deck.
Yeah.
I started it with the goal of playing Seasons Past and trying to make sure that whenever I cast Seasons Past, I had a good chance of getting 5 cards back to my hand. And so I had things from 0 to 6 fairly well spread out. And I needed to condense those a lot. So I had things at the 4 and 5 mana that I had to really consider whether they were win conditions or if there were cheaper alternatives that would be functional in the same spot, although they may be a little narrower. I think a good example of that is Cryptic Command. I replaced it with a Arcane Denial, and you still get the hard counter, which is a real point. The Cryptic Command was in there. Cryptic Command also drew you a card. 9 times out of 10, that's what it did. But, it could bounce things. I mean, it was a very catch-all spell, and it turned into what it really was trying to do is that deck, or that card 90% of the time was a counter spell that drew me a card.
Yeah.
Arcane Denial does the same thing, but it's 2 mana less, and 2 blue mana less even. So it's a lot easier to cast, and it still gets you that same interactivity that I was looking for in that slot.
Yep. So basically, the first thing, or the first big principle of competitive deck building is lowering your mana curve. Now, this has several reasons. The first big reason, in my opinion at least, is that being able to cast more things is really important.
Yes. You need to be able to not only deploy a threat, but defend that threat while it's on the stack. That's the big thing with competitive EDH is most everybody's going to have some sort of counterspell behind it, and you need to be able to navigate your win conditions in between those.
Yeah, and not just that, like, you are playing against 3 other people,
Yes.
after all. This means that you're gonna have to use up the mana you have available to develop your own board state or hand, to further develop your mana, and to possibly keep up interaction at the same time. And all of these 3 things combined sort of necessitate a deck that relies on cheap cards for the most part.
Cheap cards or fast mana. Being able to get a mana advantage early can do that, or having the everything cost 1 or 2. Either way.
Yes, fast mana is probably mandatory in competitive EDH. Simply due to having to be able to do all of these things at once. If you only get 1 land per turn and that's it, and you can't play like a mana rock or a mana dork or anything, then 9 times out of 10 it's not going to be enough.
Yeah, I do agree on that. The difficulty with the competitive format, with everybody having such low curves, you can be casting 2, 3, or 4 spells a turn on turn 2 if your turn 1 was a Soul Ring. And it's so much faster than what most people normally expect in EDH. And that I kind of also had to get my head around. I didn't have mana dorks. I really didn't like mana dorks myself. My deck building strategy was always going for the most reliable and the most permanent options. So if I could, I would rather put lands into play than put a Llanowar Elf into play. But a Llanowar Elf only costs you 1, and you get mana from it next turn. The fastest way to put extra lands into play from your hand, you're looking at like an Exploration. That's still 1, but you have to have the lands in play or in your hand in order to put them into play. Or you're looking at like Nature's Lore, and that still costs 2 to actually cast, but net only costs 1 because your land can come into play untapped.
Yep.
So it's actually slower to go the route of putting lands into play because they are more reliable. They're much harder to destroy than creatures are.
Yeah. That is certainly the case. Now, on top of just having a low mana curve and having a lot of mana acceleration, the overall average CMC of the deck is also relevant in other regards. For instance, 2 very popular cards in competitive EDH are Ad Nauseam and Dark Confidant, commonly known as Bob.
Yes.
These 2 hurt a lot if you're running big cards. Taking 7 damage off your Dark Confidant trigger or your Ad Nauseam when you're already below 10 life is problematic.
Yeah, most Ad Nauseam decks, usually their top end is a Time Spiral or a Mind's Desire, and everything else in the deck is usually at like 3 or below, except for like Aetherflux Reservoir.
Yeah.
Majority of the deck, they're trying to draw roughly 15 cards on average with an Ad Nauseam. And that gets you 2 health per card most of the time. So having a deck average CMC below 2 means you can get more cards. Or if you've got Angel's Grace, you just try your deck.
Yeah. And going along with this, being able to get more cards, which is something that almost any deck wants to do, obviously, also means that you want to be able to cast more cards, which ties back into the first thing we talked about.
Lower costs and fast mana.
Yeah. And we can also apply this principle of lower cost to a different thing. The second big principle of competitive EDH deck building is running interaction.
Yes, and interaction in multiple forms. So you've got counter spells. You've got a whole suite of free 1 and very few 2 CMC counter spells. You've got your targeted removal for creatures like Swords to Plowshares, Fatal Push, Pongify, and you've got artifact and enchantment removal, which is mainly Nature's Claim. Some people have been running Fragmentize, but most of the time it's Nature's Claim.
Yeah. And the ones you mentioned already sort of lead into the first big element of the type of interaction you want to run in competitive EDH, namely mana-efficient cards. Once again, mana efficiency is one of the big keywords. Compare, for instance, Crozen Grip and the one you mentioned earlier, Nature's Claim. Crozen Grip is 3 mana to destroy an artifact or an enchantment, but it has split second. Nature's Claim is 1 mana to destroy an artifact or enchantment, but its controller gains 4 life.
And it's surprising how little that 4 life actually matters in regards to destroying that artifact or enchantment. If you're destroying a Null Rod, you probably just opened yourself up to win the game, and you don't care that they have an extra 4 life.
Yep.
And at the same time, it was a lot cheaper. I mean, So there's pluses and minuses to Corrosion Grip. Corrosion Grip being mostly uncounterable. Yes, you can activate morphs and you can, you can unmorph and you can activate mana abilities in response to Split Second.
Yeah.
But in competitive EDH, those really don't happen, but it's still 3 mana. And that's really hard to get to just to remove something.
Yeah, I mean, you can basically think of it this way. The 2 mana you would have spent on Corrosion Grip could have been spent to further develop your board and or hand on your turn, or to maybe leave up 2 mana to counter something else someone around the table is trying to do.
Yeah, at the same time, you probably were also running a 2 mana counterspell that you could also counter anything they try to counter your Nature's Claim with. When you're building with 99 cards, usually you either try for the most efficient or the most universal cards in their slots. So you want a counterspell. You want a counterspell that does as much as it possibly can while still being a counterspell. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the reason why Cryptic Command is so popular, because it does everything.
Yeah.
At the same time, it costs a lot, and you have to leave up a lot. If your average cost to your deck is around 2, you can, say, play a Mana Rock and still leave up 2 mana for a counterspell. And you're doing more stuff on your turn than just drawing a card and saying go and letting the table go all the way around. Everybody does everything else, and you don't see something you want to counter because you had a 4 mana counterspell.
Yep. Because you're thinking to yourself, oh, I'm going to counter something really important with this, and then nobody plays important stuff.
Exactly. And you're stuck with a 2 mana rock and a Cryptic Command in your hand, and you can't play the 2 mana rock because then you only have 3. And you just sit there until you get more lands.
Yeah.
And you do nothing for multiple turns.
However, as you mentioned, Cryptic Command does have one big upside, and that is something we are also looking for in competitive EDH, namely flexible cards.
Very much so.
Being able to use your removal to get rid of a Null Rod or an Eidolon of Rhetoric, for instance, is great.
Yes, it's one of the reasons why I'm running Shadow of Doubt in Tasigur, because it does a lot of different things and it does them very well. And you can find interesting ways of interacting with things by, oh, you're tutoring, I'll Shadow of Doubt. Your tutor is countered. I essentially just cast Negate. Or Eldritch Evolution. Well, I will still do the same thing and you'll still sacrifice a creature. However, your Eldritch Evolution is also getting exiled because it is resolving anyways, rather than just being countered and in the graveyard. So there's different ways of looking at how you do your interactions while you're still in the competitive sphere.
Yep. And a perfect example of a good flexible card in competitive EDH that is also really mana efficient, especially compared to Cryptic Command, is Chain of Vapor.
Oh man.
Now, there is a lot of things you can do with Chain of Vapor. Not only can you bounce your opponent's stuff, you can, stop multiple people at once from trying to win. You can bounce your own stuff to generate a mana advantage or protect it from some kind of removal, and so on and so forth.
Oh, God.
Possibilities are honestly endless.
I remember when we posted like our episode 3 or 4 and Dan had won the game and someone was like, hey, you didn't need to do all of that. You could have won a turn earlier with Chain of Vapor.
Yeah.
And it was this Chain of Vapor line that was just like, yeah, you just sack all your lands, you bounce all your free mana rocks, you then replay them, and you end up being like +6 mana in one turn by sacking your lands and bouncing all your rocks and then recasting them because they were free.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. And I mean, like, on the surface, you'd think that Cryptic Command is actually more flexible than Chain of Vapor. But
the fact that you can repeat it and you can do it yourself, you can do it to your own things.
Yeah, And if you see that and start to realize what you can do with Chain of Vapor, you notice that that card is much more flexible than a cryptic command, which sounds weird on paper, but that's really just how it is.
Yeah, at the same time, compared to Cryptic Command, it isn't a counterspell. And so you kind of have to give up that amazing flexibility in the card for not being able to counter something. But then you say, well, I can use this on everything that's a permanent. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And you kind of play some give and take with your deck building slots.
Pretty much. And, I mean, after all, it still costs just 1 mana as opposed to 4. And that, as we mentioned earlier, is a huge thing.
Kind of on a side note, what's funny with some of these things is a few of these cards I think we're going to mention are surprisingly cheaper than the normal EDH staples that they're mostly compared to. I mean, the example of Chain of Vapor versus Cryptic Command. Cryptic Command is pretty expensive because it sees play in Modern.
Yeah.
Whereas Chain of Vapor, it's been reprinted a few times. I mean, it was just in the latest Commander's deck.
Oh, yeah.
The Commander yearly decks. And so it's notably cheaper for the same slot. Now, at the same time, competitive, you're probably dealing with dual lands. So there's that. That's a little more expensive. But some slots are a lot cheaper.
Yeah. Going to our next point, the third big principle in CDH deck building that already sort of ties into the whole Chain of Vapor thing is minimizing narrow cards.
Yes. You need to make sure that you don't have things that are just waiting to be cast. You don't want to have stuff that is destroy target human.
Yeah. You basically don't want to have cards that are going to be stuck in your hand.
You want to be able to cast them at all times.
Yeah. And on one hand, those are the expensive cards we talked about earlier, and on the other hand, those are unflexible cards. Now, of course, you're not going to be able to cast a counterspell all the time. That much is clear, but you are going to be able to use your counterspell to interact with virtually anything your opponents are going to do. Whereas, on the other hand, you are not going to be able to Doomblade your opponent's Null Rod.
Yeah, I mean, an example of trying to not do that is I've been running, actually, I had been running Sultai Charm. And for the longest time, I had it in my deck because I thought it was very universal. It could draw 2, pitch 1, destroy artifacts or enchantments, and destroy a monocolored creature. The problem with it was anytime I ever wanted to destroy a creature, it was a multicolored creature. And I had the card sitting in my hand for 10 games, and I never cast it. And it took me a while, but I finally did cut it. And you had to kind of figure out, well, what were the options that you could actually do to work around it. And I ended up going to Dimir Charm, which counters a sorcery, destroys a creature with power 2 or less, or looks at the top 3 cards of somebody's library and puts 2 in the graveyard, leaves 1 there. In looking at all the creatures I was wanting to kill, majority of the time I was wanting to kill a utility creature or a hate bear that 9 times out of 10 had power 2 or less.
Yeah, and the big one at 3 power, namely Leovold, is gone.
That is true. And so then you're just dealing with mostly generals and reanimation targets that don't really fall into that category. Almost everything else that's a creature that sees play in competitive is going to be really low power.
Yep. Now, this theory of not running narrow cards does not just apply to interaction. Another point where it's really big is win conditions.
Yes. That was the hardest one when I was transitioning Tasigur, was settling down on a smaller number of win conditions. I wanted to have more of them in my deck. I wanted to win in different ways. And it just doesn't... The best way to streamline your deck is to look at all the different ways you want to win and try to find the cheapest, most efficient method and build around that.
Yeah.
And streamline your deck for that. Now, sometimes you can slot things in next to it that are complementary, that are also win conditions. And those do work. Like an example with Tasigur is Aetherflux Reservoir. The deck isn't meant to storm out, but it has problems with losing a lot of life. So putting something in that can also sometimes just win you the game and also goes through another problem you're having is pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
But finding all the ones that don't really fit into that category took a little bit of time, and really majority of those win conditions, and you had to say, all right, I don't want to build towards this. Like Doubling Season and Planeswalkers. It's very, very fun.
That's true.
But Doubling Season is dead in your hand or on the field if you don't have a Planeswalker in your hand.
Very much so. Doubling Season is definitely a fun card, but let's imagine the following scenario here. Somebody else just Cyclonic Rifted. You have a bunch of Planeswalkers and creatures and whatnot in your hand, and you top deck a Doubling Season for the turn. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel great, but I'm probably not going to do anything except for cast Doubling Season that turn. And that makes me kind of a little sad because that Doubling Season does nothing. It's kind of the card... At that point, I have all the Planeswalkers in my hand again, and I've got Doubling Season, so now, hey, I know that the next time I cast a Planeswalker, they're going to be great. Cast an Obnixilis and just emblem somebody immediately. Now, downside with that is I'm not going to be able to cast both of those in a turn. Probably also not going to untap with that Doubling Season, because everybody knows I have Planeswalkers in hand. So it's kind of a... It's the one thing that you're really wanting to do with the deck, but sometimes it's just too narrow and it doesn't do enough. Doubling Season with Planeswalkers wins games. It can.
Yeah.
But you're still looking at...
a lot.
At a minimum 9 mana for like a Doubling Season and a Tamiyo to actually like get that all out in one turn. And that's not even countering... I mean, that's not even counting counterspells that you may have to fight through at the same time. And now you're just adding more and more mana requirements for you to get to that win condition.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like, that's not even an immediate win.
No.
You're probably going to win from that point, but you can't guarantee it.
Exactly. And some of the Planeswalkers ultimates are... They are win conditions on their own. Karn, after you have exiled several things, is huge. But being able to actually ultimate Karn in a multiplayer game is nigh on impossible unless you have a lot of stuff behind it to make that happen, or you're in a really interesting situation.
Yeah, and that basically means that you are probably winning already.
And you could have won through any method rather than restarting the game again.
And that, in a way, is also part of being competitive. Like, when we're in a position to win, we don't take ages to do so. We usually don't, like, dawdle around for a while before we actually end the game. If we have a spot where we can win, and we know it, then we go for it, and the game is over.
Then we shuffle up and we play another.
Correct.
And that's kind of one of the nicer parts that I personally have found with competitive EDH is that everybody's aiming for that, so you don't get people that just kind of toy with you.
Yeah.
They're in a dominant position, and they just sit there, and it feels like you're not having fun because you just, what's the point of casting a spell if it's going to be destroyed immediately?
Yeah, you're just waiting for them to win. And that, honestly, in my opinion, is a terrible feeling. And actually not something I'd want to do to anyone.
Yeah, I have sat in that position several times, in both casual and sometimes in competitive. It's kind of awkward with Tassiger.
Even more so with Keranos, I'd imagine.
Yeah, Keranos is really hard. There are some times where you have like, it really feels like people just look for a like a pity rule for what they call in like Little League, where 7 runs, if a team gets 7 runs, the game's just over. To make it so you're not just destroying another team entirely. But I've had games where I've had Keranos and it's done everything it's wanted to do. It's stacked out the game. And I just am waiting to draw either a tutor or the other part of my combo. I've got like 30 mana on my turn, and I'm swinging with Keranos for 6. Everybody else is doing nothing. And then it passes around to me again, and I'm still just waiting for a tutor.
Yeah.
And it gets a little frustrating for everybody else. And it's just like, eventually someone says, I'm fine moving to the next game. Are you?
Yeah, we've had that happen a couple of times, actually. And I mean, honestly, if it happens, then that's just how it is, and there's no hard feelings or anything.
Yeah.
It's like it's also sort of, if you, as the player of another deck, know that you're not gonna win this game because like the lock is too hard, then it's perfectly fine to scoop. That's an okay thing to do.
Very much so. And just saying, hey, there's nothing my deck can do to get out of this. I acknowledge you have won the game. Let's move to the next one and try again.
Yeah. However, before we drift way too far off, let's get back to the last big principle of competitive EDH deck building, and that's choosing the right commander.
Yes.
Now, what makes for a good competitive commander?
A win condition.
Yeah.
Just to put it easily, a win condition or card advantage, or both.
Pretty much.
One of the reasons of why Zur is so great is really Zur is necropotence in the command zone.
Yeah. So I've broken it down a tiny bit further, because just saying win condition is, of course, correct, but really simple. There are 3 different types of win conditions you should look at for a competitive deck. One is an outlet.
Yep.
Something like Thrasios when you've got infinite mana to draw your whole deck. Another one is a tutor, like Zur for Necropotence, or Arkham for Paradox Engine.
Yep.
And the third one is a combo piece, like Teferi with Chain Veil, or Grenzo after Doomsday.
Yeah, the big thing with that is that you always have your commander. And if there's a combo that is 2 cards, why not have one of those always available to you?
Yeah.
If you've got a really good card draw engine, say Necropotence, why not have a commander that can put it into play for you? So not only is it cheaper, it's easier to cast, and hey, it just comes into play. Nobody can counter it.
Yeah. And that's what makes some of these top decks in the format. They can just do that easily.
There is a little bit more that I think you might have glossed over, which is color identity.
Oh yeah, certainly.
You definitely can have a tutor or a combo piece in the command zone that isn't quite as useful as it could be due to color restrictions. A nice picture of that is Lynn Civi. She's mono white, but she tutors any rebel from your library and puts it into play. There are a few really fun rebels you can get, but in mono white, you really can't do too much.
Yeah, that is true.
As you start expanding out the color pie, you get more things. I mean, so mono white, go to white green. You've got like Safi Eric's daughter. Then you've got a third of Revelark and Friends in your command zone. There's several different ways you can loop Safi Eriksdotter to just win the game. Let's add in one more color. Let's add in black. And you get Carador, or you get Anafenza. And you now open up a lot more options, and you get to what we call our modern day Boonweaver or Hulkweaver decks, where you've got multiple stack outlets that'll win you the game, where you don't need to actually cast most of these. They're all done through triggers. And you kind of build towards those.
Yeah. And going at it from the other perspective, you, especially with the partners, the colors for strong EDH strategies have been a lot less restrictive, since a lot of decks just want to run either Thrasios or Tymna or both of them. And it has streamlined some strategies to a certain extent, but on the other hand, in my opinion at least, it's also made some strategies really good that weren't as good before.
That is true. Some things kind of make me a little sad about the partners with how big the power disparity is amongst them. If you look at all the partners, there's only one of them that is not specifically designed to only be activated once per turn. That's Thrasios. All of the others are limited by an upkeep trigger, a combat trigger. Actually, I think Rayhan can be, but it's not as useful.
Yeah, Rayhan is ETB, I think.
Yeah, it is ETB. So Rayhan and Thrasios. Rayhan just gets you counters, Thrasios draws you cards. And Thrasios is blue, Rayhan is not blue. And so we really have Thrasios as the giant power spike from the partner commanders. And then it's just really, what color do you want to add to that? Well, if you want black, which everybody in competitive wants black for tutors, then do you want white or red? Or if you, because at that point, white and red are free.
They are in a way, yeah.
You could get, and that's kind of one of the things that makes me a little sad about the partners, is that getting 4 colors, there's almost no downside to it now. There's a little bit for your mana, but what you get out of it is way too good.
Yeah. And one partner that has actually been doing great work in most of the slower strategies is Tymna the Weaver. And the reason behind that is that the other type of viable commander for CEDH is not a win condition, but a card advantage engine.
Mm-hmm.
The poster child of that would probably be Edric, Spymaster of Trist.
Very much so. When he starts swinging with 5 creatures and drawing 5 cards a turn, it is very scary. He's also built to just have a ton of dorks into play, and built to exploit competitive EDH not really having board wipes. He draws so many cards.
Yeah, it's insane. Like, if you let him develop his board, then Edric is really, really hard to beat.
Very much so. As a card advantage engine, there's pretty much none other that match him when built around him.
Yeah. Like, the only one that comes close in a very similar way is Tymna.
Mm-hmm.
And she, of course, has the upside of having other colors that allows decks to run a lot of hate bears, for instance, which is why we've seen a lot of Tana Tymna as of late, which is a really good deck that I'm really struggling against.
Yeah. That's also Thrasios Tymna. Most of the Boonweaver decks that just added blue by switching over to Thrasios Tymna, they kept all their hate bears and kept all the mana dorks, and then they can turn that Llanowar Elves into, hey, I draw a card.
Yep, and that's really good. So, to sum it all up, a CEDH deck needs a lot of things to be competitive. It needs a fairly low mana curve, it needs a sizable amount of interaction, it needs to not run narrow cards, and it needs to run a commander that often actively supports the strategy the deck is going for.
Very much so. Now, taking a commander that isn't a outlet, a card advantage engine, or a win condition, and trying to streamline it into competitive is surprisingly difficult.
Yes.
And one of the things that kind of has made me a little sad with the competitive versus non-competitive communities has been how quickly people are told that's not a competitive commander, we can't really help you, and how there is usually a emotional tie to that commander and wanting to stick with it and wanting to make it as best as it possibly can. And there's value to that. There definitely are some of the principles we've gone over here that can make the deck better. But noting that the commander isn't one of those things is kind of one of the first initial transition points.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even as a player who is planning to remain casual, you will probably be able to apply some of these principles to your deck and make it maybe not necessarily better, but make it run more smoothly. And that might end up feeling better.
Yeah. I mean, I personally still have an 8.5 tails mono white EDH deck. It was one of the first decks I made back in 2008. And I foiled the whole thing out. Anything that can be foiled is foiled. And it's got a bunch of nostalgia on it. But I really can't make it competitive. And I know that. And I kind of have to recognize that it's about as best as it's going to get. Maybe there's a few cards that'll change. But I can't really take it to the same spot that I could take Thrasios and Tymna. Or you could take Tasigur or Zur or Arkham. It's not a card advantage engine. It's not a combo engine. And it's definitely not an outlet. It is just I'm going to protect my stuff. Yeah, that's mono white. Let's do it. But it's still fun.
Yeah, and as they say, knowing is half the battle. And with that, we are done for today. Thank you once again for joining us. Thank you for joining me, Cameron.
Anytime.
And we'll be seeing you guys next time.